Well, happy World Storytelling Day. And the story I want to share with you today is a story that goes way, way back to the beginning of the days of the journeyman. It was a story that I created as part of a project I was involved with, a project called Habitats and Hill Forts. They were raising the profile of Cheshire's Sandstone Ridge in the northwest of England, and particularly the Sandstone Trail, which runs along that ridge of hills. And my job was to look at the local folklore and the history and retell it through a whole range of stories and associated workshops. But there was one story that I developed which became like the foundational story for all of the other tales that were part of that project. You could call it the Sandstone Tale, in fact, but it has another name. It's also known as the tale of the Ridgewyrm. And I would like to take the opportunity to tell that story again. I haven't told it for a long time, so it's great to have this World Storytelling Day to share this story with you wherever you are in the world. A story from Cheshire. Now, in order to understand this story, you have to realize that dragons would be, to all intents and purposes, immortal, able to live forever. A dragon only will die on the day that it chooses to. Yet a dragon cannot take its own life. It has to put itself into the position where it can be killed, and then it will give up its own life. Why? Well, there can be many reasons, and we'll find out one of those reasons for a particular dragon in this story. However, it quite often turns out that whoever ends up as the one who slays the dragon becomes the hero, the great champion who has rescued the princess or won back the kingdom's treasure. But actually, they would never have been able to kill the dragon unless the dragon had wanted it to be. Well, my dragon, the dragon in today's story, lived a long, long time ago in a land far, far away. I think it was actually the Gobi Desert. And it was there that this sand dragon had her home. However, she started to notice that there was something very strange going on in the desert. Even though it can be very cold in the nighttime of a desert, she noticed that there was ice that was starting to form on the rocks at night. And each morning, as the sun rose in the sky, the ice just stayed for a little longer, taking a few more moments to melt than it did the morning before. Yes, the world was changing. This dragon realized that the earth was getting colder. In fact, the earth was entering an ice age. Now, remember what I said about dragons being able to live forever? Well, with no one around to take her life, this dragon was worried. This poor sand dragon was frightened that if she should stay in the desert and sleep through the night, it might be that one morning she would wake up and the ice would be all over her, and she would not be able to break free from it, and she would be trapped for maybe an eternity under ice. And so she knew that she had to leave. And so she opened up her wings and flew up into the air. Now, let me tell you something else about dragons. You may not realize this, but perhaps you've wondered it. How can something so large take off and go into the sky and be able to fly? Well, you see, the science of dragons works a bit like this. A dragon flaps its wings, and as it does so, this generates heat. And we know that heat rises, so the heat builds up in a dragon's body, and that heat causes the dragon to rise up into the air, like a giant air balloon, hot air balloon, in fact. But of course, if the dragon generates too much heat, it could explode. So what it has to do is regulate that heat by allowing flame to come out from its mouth. That's how a dragon works. Well, so it was that our dragon, our sand dragon, escaped from the icy surface of the earth into the air, flapping her wings to keep warm and floating up, higher and higher. But as she did so, she looked down and could see that a sheet of ice was covering the desert. In fact, it was going up over the mountains and covering the whole of the earth. And so she flew through the air for hundreds and hundreds of years, flapping her wings to generate her heat and letting go with a plume of flames to regulate her own body's heat. And as she did so, the ice crystals that gathered around her were melted for a few moments. But the earth was so cold these days that those crystals were formed again. And so she kept on flapping her wings, generating heat, blowing out the flame, and hoping that this ice age would not last for many more centuries. Well, after many, many years, our sand dragon started to notice that the temperature was changing. And maybe the ice was starting to melt. And perhaps eventually she would find somewhere where she could land. But where would this be? She had lost all sense of where she was in the world. But as she flew and she looked down, she saw that there was a great open plain there, right before her. A great space where she could bring her enormous snaking body and finally be able to rest, stretching herself out across the miles and be able finally to take a sleep after the many centuries of flight. And that's what she did. Well, as she lay there sleeping, all sorts of things started to happen around her. Grass started to grow, and much of the moss and the lichen started to cover her body. And grass started to grow there as well, and bushes, and even trees. And insects started to move all throughout the foliage. And then there were birds chasing after the insects, feeding their young, building nests in the trees that were on the back of this dragon. And then many other creatures started to arrive. Of course, things like mice and foxes and rabbits, until eventually badgers and deer were moving all through that land and across the back of the sleeping dragon, until eventually the humans arrived. And when they climbed up to the top of what they thought was a long ridge of hills, they said, "This is the place that we should live. We can see for miles around us, and so we will know if any enemies are coming. And these flat lands will be perfect for grazing our cattle. And yet we can live up here on the top of the ridge where we will be safe." And so that's what they did. Until one day, some of those people discovered what they truly had made their home upon. You see, they went to the northernmost tip of that line of hills and saw, hidden away there in the bushes, the eyes of a dragon. Eyes closed, but definitely eyes. And they could see her snout. And they could notice that there were wisps of smoke rising up into the air. And they called their friends around them, and they all stared and wondered what they should do, realizing that they were living on the back of a sleeping dragon. And as they discussed amongst themselves, their voices woke up that sleeping beast. "Hello," she said. "Humans? You are living on my back?" And they nodded, too scared to speak. "Don't worry," she laughed. "I will never fly again. I have flown for centuries. All I want to do is rest. And I am pleased that you have decided to use my back to build your homes. Stay, bring up your families here, make your lives upon my back, but please, humans, will you come and speak to me? Will you tell me your stories? Tell me of what you get up to each day, and I will tell you of my life and all I have seen." And so that's what happened. The humans and the dragon became friends, and they listened to everything that she told them. She shared with them the wisdom of the ancient dragons and how to live in peace. And she was amused to hear the stories of their daily lives. In fact, they gave her a name. They called her the Ridgewyrm, worm being an ancient name for dragon, and of course her body was like a long ridge of hills. And stories of the humans living upon this dragon spread out across the country. In fact, they went over the sea, the Irish Sea, all the way to Ireland, where there lived a giant called Amos. Giant heard tales of the Ridgewyrm and he was confused. Why would it be that such a large beast would be friendly with humans and allow them to live on its back? Amos was keen to be famous, and he thought to himself that maybe he could go through the water and he could fight this kind and compassionate dragon. And he might be able to kill it and make a name for himself. And so that's what he did. He waded through the Irish Sea and made his way along the north coast of Wales until finally he came to Runcorn and climbed up onto the land by the River Mersey and saw the enormous head of the Ridgewyrm. "Ridgewyrm," he cried, "I have travelled across the sea to find you, and I have come to fight with you. Rise up and fight me, and we will see who is the strongest and who will become the famous one." And the Ridgewyrm looked and saw this proud young giant that wanted to fight with her, and yet she knew that if she was to rise up, then all of the people and all of the animals would be thrown from her back, and they could be crushed in the fight. And so she decided upon another plan. She knew that she had to stay there as the Ridge, the home for the humans and the animals of the Cheshire Plain. And so she decided that today was the day when she would make that hard dragon decision. The Ridgewyrm closed her eyes and pushed her head forward so that she stretched her neck, baring her neck. "What?" said the giant. "Are you afraid to fight me? Are you a coward?" And he lifted up his jagged sword, swung it through the air and sliced through the neck of the Ridgewyrm. Then he picked up his head in her hands and threw it into the sky, laughing as it wheeled and tumbled through the air, disappearing into the clouds. Where it landed, he did not know, and he didn't care. He had come through the sea to fight a dragon, and he had killed the dragon. And so he picked up his sword and marched back through the sea to tell his story and take his fame. However, when the Ridgewyrm's head had been cut off, all life left her body, and her body became made of hard sandstone. And all the people that lived on her back, their hearts became hard like stone as well. And they forgot the friend that was the dragon. They started to dig into the side of that great sandstone ridge and pull up great chunks of sandstone, rocks and bricks, which they used to fortify their homes and their enclosures. And so they started to fight with one another. The Cornovii, the Celts, fighting with the Romans. And then the Civil War, with people performing all sorts of atrocities in the name of their king or in name of their parliament. And so the fights went on, even into World War II, when people hid in the caves in that sandstone ridge, listening to the bombs being dropped. However, despite all of the fighting and the enemies and the battles, there were people still in that part of the world who managed to live in peace. They would gather their friends and their families around them and always have an open door for another to join them. And they would share their food, share their stories, and sing songs together. How did they do it when there was so much animosity around them? You see, when that giant Amos had thrown the head of the ridgeworm into the air, he did not see where it landed. It landed on one of the hills as part of the ridge, about halfway along that ridge, in fact, a very tall hill, which is now known as Raw Head. And there's a clue. You see, upon that ridge, there is a rock that looks remarkably like a dragon's head. Yes, it is the head of the ridgeworm. And those that had discovered it had sat down and stopped to stare and listen. And when they did, they heard the voice of the ridgeworm speaking to them. Her spirit was still there on the hills, and she spoke to their heart, and she taught them the ways of peace again. And if you should ever go to Cheshire and find the Sandstone Ridge and walk along the Sandstone Trail, make sure that you stop on Raw Head and look about, for just off the path, that rock is still there, the head of the ridgeworm. And if you stop there and listen, then maybe you will hear the spirit of the ridgeworm speaking to you, her voice speaking to your heart, teaching you to listen and how to live in peace. The peace of the ridgeworm, the dragon that gave up her life, but still allowed a part of her soul to be there on the Sandstone Ridge. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. I hope it inspires you to visit Cheshire. But either way, I hope that you're able to perhaps join me, whether it's through a recorded session or whether you join a live Zoom session for step by step, the journey into storytelling and story practice. Take a look through the Facebook page to find out more details. But most of all, have a great World Storytelling Day.